Hi, this is Brandon Smiley, owner of Thirst Gym. Today I'm going to talk about a slightly heated, debated topic, and that is CrossFit for sports performance or strength and conditioning, especially when it comes to the youth athlete. So, one question that we get asked from parents, I won't say frequently, but it does pop up from time to time, is, so and so's kid is trying CrossFit. What do you think about it? Well, my first answer is going to be if your kid wants to legitimately do CrossFit and CrossFit's what they want to do, they're not looking at doing actual competitive athletics, I think that's what you got to do. CrossFit is good at developing CrossFit athletes. That's kind of what it was designed to do. There's the CrossFit Games, and that's what the workouts are kind of tailored to do. And they're trying to design this model that creates and blends all fitness qualities into one generalized program that suits everybody's needs. Everybody's CrossFit gym tries to do things a little bit differently, so you got to take that for the caution that it is. There's also gyms that do CrossFit and they don't call it CrossFit, which to me is also undermining the fact that somebody's created a product or service that you're piggybacking off of and trying to use that market share, but not quite give your dues back to that market share, if that makes sense. But that's a video for another day. In terms of sports performance training for a youth athlete, there's a couple things that I talk to parents or people about of why I don't think CrossFit is ideal for the youth athlete. Everyone say, oh, well, they're lifting weights and they're getting stronger and they're moving better, blah, blah, blah. That may be true. You take somebody from doing nothing to something, they're going to see results. You give me a math textbook, I'm going to brush up on my algebra relatively quickly, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to make me any better at managing my business finances. So, at the end of the day, I might see a little bit of help, but then if I don't use it consistently, it's not going to help me. I'm just going to refer back to that textbook. In terms of sports performance training, what we try to make sure that we make very clear is that each sport has a different sporting demand, whether that be energy systems, strength development, hypertrophy, conditioning. There's a lot of different aspects to sport, depending upon the sport, of what's required for that sport. So you're not going to train your 100-meter sprinter like you're going to train your cross-country runner. You're not going to train your football player like you're going to train your baseball player. Will there be overlapping exercises and potentially overlapping things that you see in a program design? Yeah, of course. You can use very similar exercises to build specific movement patterns and muscle and improve tissue quality through similar means. But just because they have the same different sports doesn't mean you use the same program for everybody. So my first thing that I wanted to make sure I discuss is the principle of overload. The way that you adapt a body in a weight room is to consistently overload that body for periods of time to where the muscle adapts, grows new muscle tissue, gets stronger tendons, improved lung capacity in terms of aerobic work. All that stuff requires methodical training. You just can't go do a random exercise or a random workout every day for 365 days a year and expect to immediately be stronger at everything. Sure, there will be some carryover here and there, but generally speaking, if you're trying to make a better 100-meter runner, you've got to specifically load those muscles and movements repeatedly over time, strategically, to make them a better 100-meter runner. Doing snatches for time is not going to make you run 100 meters faster. The second thing is, all lifting is considered GPP for an athlete. That just means general physical preparedness. The weight room is a general means of improving sports performance for whatever that sport is. Now, that might be kind of saying, oh, well, isn't that what CrossFit is? It is to an extent. However, you also have to think about the long-term athletic development model. You have to think about what the long-term process is for that athlete and also the wear and tear that you're going to put on that athlete over time. So if you don't have to use a snatch, for an example, as an exercise to build triple extension. You can do triple extension through jumps and throws and different running modalities and running up hills and other exercises can do very similar things of what you're trying to get out of the exercise. Generally that's why people push the Olympic lifts in sports performance training is the triple extension. You're loading the triple extension. You're learning how to receive weight, so therefore you can quote unquote absorb force. That might be somewhat true, but if you're trying to train the triple extension, I would argue there's a lot of ways you can train triple extension more effectively, especially in the youth athlete and the population that we work with, which is middle school, high school, and some elementary kids. Trying to teach a kid how to weightlift is going to take a lot of time, and unless if we feel that we need to teach that kid because we know that kid's going to see it in high school, we don't actually start kids off with that. We let them be in our program ideally for a couple of years before we start doing that kind of stuff. The other thing is energy system specificity. So again, going back to your 100-meter and your cross-country runner, those are two entirely different energy systems. You have one that uses your creatine phosphate system, which is very fast. I mean, you're talking, about 10 seconds of work, and then the next time they run, they only, do 10, 12 seconds of work. That's a very specific energy system, where your cross-country runner is obviously using a lot of aerobic. So that's something else that you have to train that's a little bit differently. That's something that takes 2-3 minutes to tap into where you're actually training aerobic work. So when you're doing something like CrossFit, for example, the workouts are completely randomized, and what energy system you're training, at the end of the day, most of the time, it's just aerobic capacity. And if you're talking about aerobic capacity, there's much safer ways to build aerobic capacity, treadmill work, rowers, tempo runs. Heck, the sporting demand of cross-country running itself is an aerobic work. That's why none of our runners in here do any kind of aerobic work, because they run 5 to 6 days a week. I think they're getting their aerobic work covered pretty well, but handled by the sport coach. So that's another thing that's not really thought about in terms of CrossFit. It's just like, let's just do this exercise or these workouts as fast as we can for time, or so many rounds, or whatever the workout calls for the day. And the other problem is with that is that every workout for CrossFit is always different. Going back to our overload principle, we're talking about how we have to consistently overload the system repeatedly, time after time after time after time. So if you only back squat once a month, how are you going to overload the system once a month if you're not doing anything to basically train the squat or get the squat stronger? So for example, you're not using a builder or a supplemental exercise, maybe a front squat, maybe a goblet squat, maybe a safety bar box squat, whatever it is. If you're not consistently training a movement pattern to improve the squat pattern or the squat strength, is that going to transfer over to sport? I don't know. In terms of athletes, you also have to think about arm and hip care. Athletes are not fragile, but you have to be careful with what you do a little bit, because in a sport like baseball, their shoulder is basically everything. If they can't throw a baseball, they're basically a useless baseball player, unless if they're going to DH and just hit. So especially when you're talking about a pitching population, I don't think you have to do this like crazy, ridiculous arm care thing every time before you see them, but I do think that you should train a baseball player a little bit differently than you're going to train your lineman, who doesn't require that shoulder mobility, who doesn't require, having a more lax shoulder to be able to create that whip on the ball whenever they're throwing. And, think about how many times a baseball player throws a baseball in a year. It's astronomical. That's not even including a pitcher who, is throwing 60, 70 pitches a game, potentially. Week in and week out, and that's why we're, against, specificity in terms of doing one sport year-round forever from ages 7 till whenever. That comes back to arm and hip care. In terms of hips, I think it's completely great to be able to do things like front squat and sumo deadlifts and, doing different lunging patterns and things like that, and that requires a good amount of hip mobility and hip care. But if you're consistently going to do things where you're jumping up and down on boxes and repetitively getting all these ground contacts that aren't required for the sport, I think you're doing damage long-term to the athlete, and that's a disservice to the athlete, because a injured athlete is a useless athlete. If they're not on the field, they can't do their sport. And if they can't do their sport, they're not going to do the sport anymore, or they're not going to go to college, or they're not going to make the varsity team. And, to some of these kids, that's a really big deal. And when they come looking for a service, or their parents come looking for a service that's going to give their athlete the best chance to be on the field or get that college scholarship, I think you got to do everything in your power to take care of those shoulders and elbows and hips, even if you can. There's some stuff that you can and can't control, and that's up to the sport coach. But in the weight room, if you are their coach, you have generally say about everything, so you can make smart exercise choices and selections to help that athlete succeed. Another thing is excessive mobility means that you have a decreased stability component. So this kind of goes back to your shoulder and hip, because that's where you have the greatest amount of mobility is in your shoulder and your hip. But whenever you have high degrees of mobility, you're going to lack stability. So every joint kind of stacks on top of the body. You go from your ankle to your knee to your hip to your lumbar spine to your T-spine, etc. And as you change, so the ankle generally requires mobility. The knee requires stability. The hip requires mobility. The lumbar spine requires stability. The T-spine, requires mobility. Those are things that are known. They are fact. That is what makes human movement so fluid and so well, because when all that stuff works together in unison and is working great, you have a very good athlete, a very good human being in terms of quality of movement. When one link down the chain gets affected, it can affect every other link up the chain, and that can be a problem for an athlete. So if you've got a hip that requires mobility and it gets really, really tight from doing repetitive stuff that's not required for sport, you're creating maybe too much stability in a sport that requires a good amount of mobility. Think of gymnastics, for example. Or in terms of having good mobility in your shoulder, that's also very important, but you also have to have, stability of how you control those shoulder blades and how they move and how that basically glenohumeral joint operates in sport. So, you can get an athlete to be better, but you have to focus on mobility or stability. And I don't think CrossFit addresses that. It's specifically for certain athletic populations. When you just throw an athlete into a CrossFit class, that class isn't dedicated for that athlete. It's designed for the CrossFit gym that's doing it, which basically lumps everybody into one thing. So I think that's kind of a problem. Another thing is that hard workouts are not the same thing as good workouts. What I mean by that is just because you sweat your butt off and you get rhabdo and you have all these badges of shame of like destroying your body and your hook grip's all torn up and you got scabs and stuff and you missed the plyo box and your shins are ate up and you're drenched and you're dead every time you go home. That doesn't mean you had a good workout. Matter of fact, it probably means you overtrained for that specific workout. And when it comes to athletes and athletic populations, something you have to consider is they have a sport outside of the weight room. Going back to that GPP thing that we were talking about, is the weight room is designed to make the athlete better on the field or court or the pool or whatever their athletic endeavor is. And if what you're doing in the weight room is taking away from that specific event that athlete does, and it makes them worse on the field because they can't recover from the workouts they're doing in the gym, that is a major problem. That is probably the number one problem other than getting hurt, which in turn, that probably will lead to the athlete getting hurt. Then you start to see a major problem when it comes to sports and how that implements. And then lifting weights gets this really bad rap. So think about what you're doing in the weight room, how it transfers to what the sport is doing will help the athlete. But sometimes doing less is doing more. Maybe you cut a set short here and you cut a couple reps here, or you even pull a whole superset out of the exercise because the athlete's just not feeling it that day. That's completely fine. We do that on the regular. Kids come in beat up from practice. They feel like crap. Hey, I got a game in 2 days. I don't feel that great. You know what we do? We pull back our volume of work. We might pull back our intensity. We might do a little bit more soft tissue care. We make sure we listen to what the client and the athlete's saying, where I can't say for certain that CrossFit's going to do that, because in CrossFit, it's a badge of honor to finish your workout. And here, your workout isn't worth the paper that it's written on. It's a guideline. It's a very good guideline, but it's not in ink. We can cross stuff out and make changes. And to me, that's what a good strength and conditioning and sports performance program does, is tailor it towards the athlete, towards that specific day. The final thing I want to talk about is long-term athletic development. What is long-term athletic development? The first thing is it's a long-term model looked at how we develop an athlete from a very young age, let's just say 6 or 7, and how we get that athlete to let's just say a college-based athlete, okay? Ideally, the long-term athletic development model was looked at how we get to a kid from around that age and we get them in the right pool to do the right sports at the right time so they have the best chance to succeed to potentially make the Olympics. That's what China and Russia, Bulgaria did it a little bit differently by destroying their athletes, but they had a long-term athletic development model that they use, and hockey is becoming very popular at this, and hockey is doing very well with it. I think as a coach, you have to think about that, and that can be a very hard sell from a business standpoint in a private sector, but like myself, is getting a parent and an athlete to buy in long-term. It's like, the 3 to 6 months of training that we're going to do is going to be great. We're going to build a good foundation. We're going to fix some movement patterns. We're going to get them stronger, explosive. Absolutely, that's going to happen. But the thing is, as soon as you stop coming, that stuff's going to start to go away. And as it goes away, then you're going to get a detraining effect. And as you get a detraining effect, eventually you could get hurt because you're not training at what you were doing. So you're not able to do quite what you were able to do. So from a long-term athletic development standpoint, we just start very basic and we try to say, hey, if you're willing to buy into this long-term and you're coming in here at 9, 10 years old, 8 years of training, 8 years of real training. Think of how many people you know that have been consistently in a weight room 2, 3, 4 days a week for 8 years straight, and what they've done in that time frame. Every person that I can think that's consistently been in a weight room, I'm not talking about like, oh, they go out for 3 months and stop lifting. No, I'm talking about even during the crappy times, they're getting in the gym once or twice to at least maintain so they can ramp back up for the next competition, the next sporting event, the next adventure in their life. Anyone that's been in training for that long generally is somebody that's kind of done something. They're not weak, they're not slow, they're a very good athletic specimen. And I think that's a tough sell to parents, is because we think, what can we do to help your child succeed? Not necessarily now. Yes, we want to see improvement now, but what's the long-term goal? And if you're not asking what that long-term goal is to yourself as a parent or an athlete, I think you're missing kind of the big picture. It's a good idea to think in 6, 12-month training blocks, or even just looking at what that will do for your career. But I think if you're getting in this at a young age and at the right time, and your parents are doing the right thing, or you parents are doing the right thing, and you're thinking about that long-term athletic development model, that can do a lot for your child's success, because you're just going to talk about rotating sports during seasons, playing multiple sports, and how research has ridiculously proved that doing the same sport year-round from a young age on is not intelligent. So if you're a parent, please talk to your kid about trying to try something new. Even if it's all the time, it doesn't matter. Just try to get them to try something. But the weight room is a great bridge to that, because you're doing different movement patterns in the weight room that you necessarily don't encounter always on the field. Knowing how to hinge is important, but I don't see a hinge specifically all the time in sport, especially in some sports. Or, let's use CrossFit, for example, since we're talking about CrossFit. A kipping pull-up, you're not going to see that a whole lot in sport. The only time you're going to be close to seeing it's maybe in a pool. So we've got to think about how some of these exercises intervene with each other, and how that can help build the athlete from a long-term perspective. And I don't think CrossFit addresses that whatsoever. I don't even think they address that for their own business model and their own CrossFit affiliates and stuff. I don't know how their daily programming works. I just know it's on a website. Is somebody truly programming it? I don't know. I know that there's amazing services out there that are doing a good job of that and trying to change the culture and the landscape of what CrossFit is doing. But those people are even programming for the average person in a CrossFit box, not the competitive CrossFitter, which is a little bit different. And I think you have to make that specificity and that denotation that doing CrossFit and competing in CrossFit are two different things. So when it comes to an athlete, and you have an athlete doing CrossFit, how does that transfer over to sport? So I know this was a very long video, but give it some thought, marinate about it. Let me know your thoughts, your comments, and what you think about it. Ideally, what I want as a coach is the best chance for the athlete to succeed. And if I genuinely thought CrossFit was the best way to do that, I would have a CrossFit gym. I really would. But research, coaches, strength and conditioning coaches, professionals in the field, we know that that's not the best way to prepare an athlete for sport in terms of strength and conditioning and sports performance. And so I just listed my reasons of why we don't use it and why I don't like it. Are there things that I like about it? Absolutely. I think CrossFit has done a tremendous amount for the health and fitness field as a whole. But in terms of sports performance, I don't think it's actually edged or pushed the sports performance realm any better. I think it's made some certain machines and certain little minor things that's in the fitness field a little more popular. Concept 2 rower, for example, or skier, for example. Those are very popular now because of CrossFit. You would probably never seen those in a strength and conditioning facility prior to CrossFit, but now probably most of the D1 colleges at least have a Concept 2 rowers in there. But like I said, give that some thought, marinade, comments, whatever. Have any questions, leave them in the comments section. DM me, send me an email, come by Thirst Gym. Would love to talk and see how we can help you. Thanks. Have a great day.